Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, visionary of the Republic. Introduction. Few figures in history have reshaped a nation as profoundly as Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Born into the twilight years of the Ottoman Empire, he would rise from a determined military officer to a revolutionary leader who carved a new destiny for Turkey. His vision was bold, his reforms were relentless, and his influence remains deeply embedded in the fabric of modern Turkey. Atatürk did not merely change laws, he transformed mindsets, guiding a fractured empire into a unified republic. From the battlefields of Gallipoli to the halls of power in Ankara, Atatürk's journey was marked by defiance against stagnation, resistance to foreign domination, and an unshakable belief in the sovereignty of his people. He overthrew an outdated monarchy, abolished the Caliphate, and laid the foundations of a secular democratic state. His leadership was not without struggle. He faced internal opposition, foreign threats, and the immense challenge of dismantling centuries-old traditions. This documentary unravels the life, battles, and legacy of Atatürk, a man who stood against the tide of history and reshaped the fate of millions. This is the story of a visionary who forged a republic from the ruins of an empire. Part 1. The Birth of a Leader, a Child of the Ottoman Empire. In the year 1881, in the bustling port city of Salonika, a child was born into a world teetering on the edge of collapse. The Ottoman Empire, once a formidable force stretching across continents, was now a shadow of its former glory, plagued by internal strife and external pressures. In this uncertain landscape, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk took his first breath, unaware that he would one day be the man to reshape history. His father, Ali Reza Effendi, a customs officer turned timber merchant, held modest ambitions, hoping to provide a stable future for his family. His mother, Zubayd Hanım, was a deeply religious woman who found solace in tradition, her beliefs shaping the early years of Mustafa's upbringing. The family lived a simple life, caught between the old and the new, as the empire itself wrestled with the same contradiction. Even as a child, Mustafa displayed a strong-willed nature, sharp intelligence, and an unyielding curiosity. But life was not kind to the young boy. His father's untimely death left the family vulnerable, forcing them to move to the countryside, where his mother sought a more traditional upbringing for him. She wished for her son to receive a religious education, hoping he would follow a path of piety and stability in an empire where faith was still a dominant force. But Mustafa was different. He was drawn not to the past but to the future, to progress, to modernity. His mind was restless, questioning, unwilling to accept the rigid structures imposed upon him. Against his mother's initial wishes, he enrolled at the Semsi Efendi School, an institution that embraced contemporary education rather than strict religious teachings. It was here that he first encountered the power of structured learning, discipline, and logical reasoning, qualities that would define his leadership in the years to come. Yet the empire's decline was not just a distant reality, it was everywhere around him. Salonika, a melting pot of cultures, was a city where the cracks of Ottoman rule were evident. Political unrest simmered beneath the surface, and nationalist ideas began to take root among the young minds of the time. Mustafa absorbed these influences, his vision slowly taking shape even as he was still just a student. At the age of 12, he made a fateful decision, one that would set him on an irreversible path. He enrolled in the Monastir Military High School, defying his mother's concerns, embracing a world of discipline, strategy, and purpose. Here, he encountered the works of European thinkers, military theorists, and reformists who believed in modern governance rather than the decaying system of the empire. He studied history, politics, and warfare with unrelenting focus, sharpening his intellect and fueling his desire for change. It was during these formative years that Mustafa gained the name Kemal, meaning perfection, bestowed upon him by a teacher who recognized his brilliance. It was not just a name, it was a foreshadowing of the relentless pursuit of excellence that would define his entire life. As he looked beyond the classroom walls, he saw a world in turmoil, an empire in its final throes, a people clinging to traditions that no longer served them. But Mustafa Kemal was different. He would not accept fate as it was dictated to him. He would challenge it, reshape it, and forge a new path. A path that would lead him from the classroom to the battlefield, from the shadows of a crumbling empire to the heights of revolutionary leadership. The boy from Salonika was ready to step into history. The world just didn't know it yet. Part 2: Military Brilliance, the making of a young commander. The decaying Ottoman Empire was a crucible of conflict, and within its collapsing walls, Mustafa Kemal sharpened his mind like a blade. His years at the Monastir Military High School had ignited something deep within him, an unyielding thirst for knowledge, strategy, and reform. But it was in the Imperial Military Academy in Istanbul that his transformation truly began. Arriving in the imperial capital, Mustafa Kemal found himself in a city that mirrored the empire's decline. The Ottoman court, draped in tradition and excess, remained blind to the shifting tides of power. Corruption ran deep, and the military, once the backbone of Ottoman dominance, had become bloated and ineffective. Yet, while many resigned themselves to fate, Mustafa Kemal saw opportunity. If the empire was crumbling, he would learn how to rebuild. At the academy, he immersed himself in the study of modern warfare. He devoured the works of European military theorists, absorbing lessons from Napoleon, Clausewitz, and von Moltke, blending their ideas with his own vision of disciplined, strategic leadership. His mind was analytical, precise, always calculating the next move. While others followed orders blindly, he questioned them, dissected them, sought to understand not just how wars were fought, but how they were won. His sharp intellect and unyielding discipline quickly set him apart. Unlike many of his peers, who accepted the empire's rigid doctrines, Mustafa Kemal envisioned a modern professional military, a force driven by merit, not birthright. This independent thinking did not go unnoticed. Some saw his brilliance, others saw a threat. But nothing would deter him. Graduating in 1905 as a captain, Mustafa Kemal entered an army that was fractured and deeply politicized. The Ottoman military was no longer a unified force. It was a battleground of ideologies, loyalists, reformists, and revolutionaries all vying for control. His first assignment took him to Damascus, a city under Ottoman rule but seething with rebellion. It was here that he witnessed firsthand the rot eating away at the empire. The government's response to dissent was brutal, yet ineffective. Oppression did not breed loyalty, it bred resistance. Realizing that reform within the existing system was impossible, Mustafa Kemal took a dangerous step. He aligned himself with a secret revolutionary group, an underground movement of officers who sought to save the empire through radical change. This was a perilous path. Speaking against the Sultan's rule was treason, and the consequences were severe. But Mustafa Kemal was never one to bow to fear. In the following years, his reputation as both a skilled strategist and a revolutionary thinker grew. He was transferred to Salonika, where he joined the Committee of Union and Progress, the movement that would later lead the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. The empire was on the brink of upheaval, and he was at the heart of it. But unlike many revolutionaries, Mustafa Kemal was not driven by blind ideology. He was driven by pragmatism, by the belief that the Ottoman state needed a complete transformation to survive. While others debated politics, he remained focused on military excellence. He saw firsthand how outdated strategies had led to Ottoman defeats, how a lack of discipline had cost lives, how clinging to the past had left the empire vulnerable to foreign powers. He was determined to change that. By the time he was promoted to major in 1911, Mustafa Kemal had already earned the respect of those who recognized his potential, and the enmity of those who feared what he represented. But his true test was yet to come. The world was about to descend into chaos, and he would soon find himself on the battlefield, proving not just his intellect, but his courage, his leadership, and his unshakable vision. The strategist had been forged. The commander was ready. And history was waiting. Part 3: Gallipoli, Defying the Invincible Powers. War had erupted. The great empires of Europe were locked in a struggle that would reshape the world, and the dying Ottoman Empire was dragged into the fire. In 1915, as the Allied powers sought to crush the Ottomans and open a direct route to Russia, their eyes turned to the strategic Dardanelles Strait. If they succeeded, Constantinople would fall, and the empire would be carved apart. The Ottoman military, weakened by years of corruption and mismanagement, stood little chance against the mighty British and French forces. But one man refused to accept defeat. Mustafa Kemal, now a lieutenant colonel, had been stationed in Gallipoli, a rugged and unforgiving stretch of land that would soon become the stage for one of history's most brutal battles. The Allied plan was clear: launch a massive naval bombardment, land overwhelming forces, and crush Ottoman resistance in days. But war is not won on paper. It is won in the trenches, in the fire of battle, in the unbreakable will of those who refuse to surrender. When the first wave of British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops stormed the shores, chaos erupted. Ottoman forces, underprepared and overwhelmed, began to retreat. But Mustafa Kemal saw what others did not. A single moment, a single command, could change the course of history. Racing to the front lines, he found his men breaking under the relentless assault. He did not hesitate. With steel in his voice, he ordered them to hold their ground. "I do not order you to attack," he declared. "I order you to die." His words were not just commands, they were a promise. A promise that he would stand with them, fight with them, bleed with them. Inspired by his defiance, his men dug in, turning the hills of Gallipoli into an unyielding fortress. Wave after wave of Allied soldiers crashed against their defenses, but they did not break. Every inch of land was paid for in blood, every trench became a grave, yet they held on. For months, Gallipoli became a nightmare of mud, fire, and death. The Allies, confident in their superiority, found themselves trapped in a hellish stalemate, unable to break through the Ottoman lines. Mustafa Kemal, displaying unmatched tactical brilliance, countered every move, anticipating enemy assaults before they began. His knowledge of terrain, his ability to inspire his men, and his sheer resilience turned what should have been a crushing defeat into an unthinkable victory. By the end of 1915, the Allies, exhausted and demoralized, made a stunning decision. They abandoned Gallipoli. Their unstoppable invasion had failed. The Ottoman Empire had defied the greatest military powers of the time, and at the heart of that victory stood one man. Mustafa Kemal had not only saved the Dardanelles, but had proven that he was no ordinary commander. News of his triumph spread across the empire. In a nation drowning in losses, he had given them hope. He had outmaneuvered the most powerful armies in the world, but more importantly, he had shown that the Ottoman people could still fight, still resist, still stand. He emerged from Gallipoli not just as a hero, but as a symbol of resilience, of defiance, of a new future waiting to be forged. But while Gallipoli had secured his legend, it had also revealed a brutal truth. The Ottoman Empire had won a battle, but it was losing the war. The cracks were widening, the foundations crumbling, and soon, the entire structure would collapse. And when it did, Mustafa Kemal would not stand among the ruins. He would build something new. Part 4: The Empire's Collapse, Witnessing the Ottoman Downfall. The Ottoman Empire, once a mighty force stretching across 3 continents, was now on its last breath. Centuries of military overreach, internal corruption, and economic decline had left it fragile, struggling to hold itself together. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was no longer an empire expanding its borders. It was a collapsing giant, desperately trying to prevent further disintegration. For Mustafa Kemal, who had spent his early years rising through the ranks of the Ottoman military, the downfall of the empire was not just a distant political crisis. It was a catastrophe unfolding before his eyes. The empire's decline had been in motion for decades. The once feared Ottoman military had suffered humiliating defeats against European powers. Its navy had been outclassed, and its economic system was in shambles. The government, still ruled by the Sultan, was riddled with inefficiency and unable to keep up with the modern world. The 1908 Young Turk Revolution had briefly raised hopes of reform, but internal divisions and power struggles only deepened the crisis. As European nations carved away Ottoman territory piece by piece, the empire found itself increasingly at the mercy of foreign powers. Then came the First World War, a war that would prove to be the final blow. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, aligning itself with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the hopes of reclaiming lost prestige. But this decision would lead to disaster. From the battlefields of the Middle East to the trenches of the Caucasus, Ottoman forces suffered heavy casualties, drained of resources and morale. While Mustafa Kemal gained fame for his heroic defense at Gallipoli, the rest of the empire was crumbling. British and French forces dismantled Ottoman control in the Arab world, while Russian and Armenian forces threatened from the east. By 1918, as Germany and its allies faced inevitable defeat, the Ottomans were on the verge of total collapse. The signing of the Armistice of Mudros on October 30, 1918, marked the official surrender of the Ottoman Empire. The once great empire was now under foreign occupation, its government completely powerless. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces took control of key Ottoman cities, including Istanbul, and dictated terms that stripped the empire of its remaining authority. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 would finalize the empire's humiliation, carving up Anatolia and giving vast territories to Greece, Armenia, and European powers. The Sultan, desperate to maintain his rule, accepted the terms, even as the empire itself ceased to exist in all but name. For Mustafa Kemal, this was an unforgivable betrayal. He had fought for the empire, defended its land, and believed in its survival, but now he saw that the Ottoman system was beyond saving. The Sultan had surrendered without resistance, allowing foreign forces to divide the Turkish homeland. If Turkey was to survive, it would not be under the rule of the Sultan or the crumbling Ottoman institutions. It would have to be something new. As foreign soldiers marched through Ottoman streets and nationalists grew restless, Mustafa Kemal made a fateful decision. He would no longer serve the dying empire. He would fight for a new Turkey, a Turkey free from foreign rule, free from the failures of the past, and free to determine its own future. The Ottoman Empire was dead, but the fight for a new nation was just beginning. Part 5, The Fight for Independence, A Nation on the Brink. The Ottoman Empire had fallen, but Mustafa Kemal refused to accept its fate. The once mighty empire was now reduced to a shadow of its former self, its lands divided by foreign powers, its capital occupied, and its sultan nothing more than a puppet of the British. Yet, what angered Mustafa Kemal the most was not just the foreign occupation. It was the weakness of the Ottoman leadership. The sultan, instead of resisting, had accepted subjugation, signing away the empire's future with the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. This treaty did not just strip the empire of its territories. It carved Anatolia apart, handing much of western Turkey to Greece, the east to Armenia, and the south to the French. What remained was a broken nation, leaderless and on the brink of total collapse. But Kemal was not willing to surrender. If the Ottoman government would not fight, then he would. And he knew exactly where to begin. On May 19, 1919, Mustafa Kemal landed in Samsun, a city on the Black Sea coast. This was no ordinary journey. It was the beginning of a revolution. Officially, he had been sent by the Ottoman government to oversee the disbanding of resistance groups, but in reality, he had no intention of following orders. Instead, He immediately began organizing a nationalist movement, one that would reject foreign rule and fight for Turkey's independence. The situation was desperate. Greek forces had already landed in Izmir on May 15, 1919, unleashing terror on Turkish civilians as they marched deeper into Anatolia. In the east, Armenian forces were advancing, and in the south, French troops were securing Ottoman territories for their own empire. Meanwhile, the British had occupied Istanbul, controlling the Sultan and ensuring that no resistance came from the Ottoman leadership. The Turkish homeland was being ripped apart from every direction. But while the Sultan stood idle, Mustafa Kemal was preparing for war. His first step was to unite the scattered resistance groups under one banner. In Erzurum, in July 1919, he gathered nationalist leaders for a crucial meeting. Here, he made a bold declaration: the Turkish nation was indivisible, and no foreign power had the right to rule over it. This was the first official rejection of the Treaty of Sèvres. The Sultan's government, still hoping to appease foreign rulers, saw this as an act of rebellion. But Mustafa Kemal was just getting started. 2 months later, in September 1919, he held a second Congress in Sivas, where he solidified a nationalist front. Here, he made an even bolder move. He officially cut ties with the Ottoman government, stating that only the Turkish people, not the Sultan, had the right to decide their future. This was treason in the eyes of the old regime, but for the Turkish people, it was the first spark of true independence. The reaction from Istanbul was swift and ruthless. The Sultan, under pressure from the British, stripped Mustafa Kemal of his military titles, declared him a traitor, and issued an order for his execution. Soldiers loyal to the old regime were sent to capture him, but they failed. Across Anatolia, people saw the Sultan's betrayal and rallied behind Mustafa Kemal instead. Towns began swearing loyalty to his movement, militias organized themselves under his command, and resistance fighters prepared for war. With Ankara now emerging as the stronghold of the nationalist movement, Mustafa Kemal formed a new government, directly challenging the Sultan's rule in Istanbul. Turkey was now a nation with two competing authorities, one controlled by a submissive Sultan, the other led by a fearless revolutionary. The war for Turkey's future was no longer avoidable. It had begun. Part 6: Ankara rises, declaring war against occupation. The Ottoman Empire was on its knees. Istanbul was under Allied occupation, the Sultan was a powerless puppet, and the Treaty of Sèvres had carved up Anatolia for foreign powers. Mustafa Kemal, now the face of resistance, knew that survival depended on action. Turkey needed a new center of power, far from enemy reach. He turned to Ankara, an unassuming town in central Anatolia, where he would launch the fight for independence. Ankara was not a city of grandeur, nor did it hold political significance like Istanbul. But what it offered was strategic isolation, security, and the chance to rebuild from the ground up. In early 1920, Kemal established his headquarters there, gathering loyal commanders, intellectuals, and political leaders who refused to submit to foreign rule. This was more than a relocation. It was a deliberate shift from the dying Ottoman system to a new, nationalist movement. But Kemal knew that a resistance force alone would not be enough. If he wanted to challenge the Sultan's legitimacy, he needed to create an alternative government, one that could declare war, pass laws, and unite the people under a single vision. On April 23, 1920, Kemal founded the Grand National Assembly of Turkey (GNA) in Ankara, a direct act of defiance against the Sultan's rule. The assembly, made up of nationalist leaders, formally rejected the Treaty of Sèvres, condemned foreign occupation, and declared itself the sole authority over Turkey. This was a revolutionary moment. For the first time in centuries, Turkish rule was no longer tied to a sultan. The reaction from Istanbul was immediate and ruthless. The Sultan, under British pressure, declared Mustafa Kemal a traitor and issued a death warrant against him. But words were not enough to stop the nationalist movement. The Sultan's forces, backed by the British, formed the Invincible Caliphate army and marched toward Ankara, determined to wipe out the rebellion before it could gain more ground. The battle for Ankara had begun. The Caliphate army was better armed, supplied by British forces, and reinforced by loyalist militias, believing they were defending the Sultanate and Islamic rule. But Kemal's forces had something greater: the will of the people. His men, though outnumbered, used superior tactics, guerrilla warfare, and deep knowledge of the Anatolian terrain to counter the Sultan's forces. Town by town, village by village, the Caliphate army was outmaneuvered, ambushed, and systematically dismantled. Within weeks, Kemal's forces had crushed the last major attempt by the Sultan to reclaim authority. The Ottoman Empire's grip on Anatolia had effectively ended. But a far greater enemy was now at Turkey's doorstep. Greece, backed by Britain and France, launched a full-scale invasion, pushing deep into Anatolia. Their goal was simple: destroy the Turkish resistance before it could fully mobilize. As Greek forces advanced, capturing key cities and massacring Turkish civilians, Kemal knew that the true war had just begun. The fight for Turkey's survival would now be settled on the battlefield, and Ankara would stand as the last stronghold of the Turkish nation. Part 7: The Birth of a Republic, Toppling the Ottoman Monarchy. The war for Turkey's survival was in full force. Mustafa Kemal had crushed the Sultan's loyalist army, but the greatest challenge was still ahead: the full-scale Greek invasion, backed by Britain and France, aimed at wiping out Turkish resistance. While Ankara stood firm as the new heart of the nationalist movement, the Ottoman monarchy in Istanbul clung to its last threads of power, still recognizing foreign occupation and refusing to support the fight for independence. For Kemal, this was unacceptable. The Sultan had betrayed his own people, signing away Turkish lands in the Treaty of Sèvres, refusing to fight, and actively working against the nationalist movement. As long as the monarchy existed, there would always be a danger of foreign-backed counterattacks and internal divisions. If Turkey was to be truly independent, the Sultanate had to fall. But first, the war had to be won. By 1921, Greek forces had pushed deep into Anatolia, taking control of several cities and inching closer to Ankara. The war was at a critical point. If Ankara fell, the nationalist movement would be crushed, and Turkey would be divided between foreign powers forever. Mustafa Kemal, now fully in command of the Turkish army, prepared for a decisive battle. On August 23, 1921, the Battle of Sakarya began, the longest and bloodiest battle of the war. Kemal personally led the defense, rallying his troops with the famous words, "There is no defense line, only a defense area. That area is the entire country, not one step back." For 22 days and nights, Turkish forces fought with everything they had. The Greek army, though well-equipped, was stretched too far into enemy territory, their supply lines weak, and their morale crumbling. By September, the Turks counterattacked with full force, driving the Greeks back westward. The war had taken a dramatic turn. For the first time, the Greeks were on the defensive. Over the next year, Kemal's forces launched the Great Offensive by Overhaul. In August 1922, a final push to expel Greek forces entirely. Within days, the Turkish army stormed into Izmir, the last major Greek stronghold, setting the city free on September 9, 1922. The war was won. But victory on the battlefield was only half the fight. The Ottoman Sultan still sat on the throne in Istanbul, and as long as he remained, foreign powers could use him to undermine the new Turkish state. It was time for the final blow. With the war won, Kemal moved swiftly to dismantle the Sultanate. On November 1, 1922, the Grand National Assembly formally abolished the Ottoman monarchy, ending over 600 years of rule. The Sultan Mehmed VI refused to accept reality, desperately hoping the British would intervene to save him. But no help came. On November 17, 1922, under the cover of night, Sultan Mehmed VI fled Istanbul aboard a British warship, effectively ending the Ottoman dynasty. For the first time in centuries, Turkey was free from both foreign rule and Ottoman monarchy. But a new question arose: what would replace it? The battle for independence was over, but the battle to build a new nation had just begun. Part 8. Abolishing the Caliphate, breaking with the past. The Sultan was gone. The Ottoman monarchy had crumbled, and for the first time in centuries, Turkey was no longer ruled by a dynasty. But one final remnant of the old order remained: the Caliphate. While the Sultan had wielded political power, the Caliph was the religious leader of all Muslims, a position that carried immense influence across the Islamic world. With the Ottoman Empire gone, many hoped that Turkey would at least preserve the Caliphate, maintaining its spiritual leadership over millions. Mustafa Kemal had other plans. To him, the Caliphate represented the last chain tying Turkey to its imperial past, an institution that could be used by religious and political forces to challenge the new republic. The nationalist movement had fought for a modern independent state, not a religious authority that could be manipulated by foreign or domestic interests. But dismantling the Caliphate was not as simple as abolishing the Sultanate. It was deeply embedded in Turkish society, Islamic tradition, and global politics. If Kemal moved too quickly, he risked sparking outrage not just within Turkey, but across the Muslim world. Initially, he took a calculated approach. On November 1, 1922, when the Sultanate was abolished, the Caliphate was left intact, but stripped of any political power. The Grand National Assembly elected Abdülmecid II as the new caliph, but he was nothing more than a ceremonial figurehead. This was Kemal's first step, reducing the Caliphate to a powerless symbol. But tensions grew. Many conservative factions and religious leaders saw Abdülmecid II as their last hope to restore Islamic rule, and whispers of a counter-movement began to spread. Some believed that with enough support, the caliph could be reinstated as a ruler, reversing the changes Kemal had made. This was exactly what he had feared. In 1923, Turkey officially became a republic, with Kemal elected as its first president. The shift was monumental. A country that had been an empire for centuries had now become a modern nation-state. But even as the Republic of Turkey was established, the Caliphate remained a looming threat, a symbol that conservative groups could rally around to resist secular reforms. By 1924, Kemal decided that there was no room for compromise. The time had come to break with the past completely. On March 3, 1924, the Grand National Assembly officially abolished the Caliphate, removing Abdülmecid II from his position and expelling the entire Ottoman family from Turkey. The last remaining link to the Ottoman era was gone. The reaction was explosive. Across the Muslim world, protests erupted, with religious leaders condemning Turkey's decision. Many saw it as an attack on Islam itself, a betrayal of centuries of tradition. But Kemal was unmoved. He saw Turkey's future in modernization, science, and progress, not in clinging to outdated institutions that had led to the empire's decline. With the Caliphate gone, Kemal had removed the final obstacle standing in the way of his vision for Turkey. But the hardest part was still ahead: transforming an ancient, deeply religious society into a modern, secular republic. The battle for independence was over, but the battle for Turkey's identity had just begun. Part 9. Revolutionizing Turkey: Bold Reforms and Radical Change. With the Caliphate abolished and the Ottoman monarchy dismantled, Mustafa Kemal stood at a crossroads. The Republic of Turkey had been declared, but it was still a nation deeply rooted in centuries of religious tradition, outdated laws, and old power structures. To truly transform Turkey, revolutionary change was needed, not gradual reforms, but bold, sweeping transformations that would redefine the country's identity. Kemal wasted no time. His vision was clear: Turkey would be a modern, secular, and Western-oriented state, free from the remnants of Ottoman rule. But this was no easy task. The very fabric of Turkish society had been shaped by Islamic traditions and imperial rule for over 600 years. Every aspect of life, from governance to education, from the legal system to clothing, had to be rebuilt from the ground up. One of his first and most radical moves was abolishing Sharia law. The Ottoman Empire had been governed under Islamic law, where religious courts held authority over civil matters. This, Kemal believed, was holding Turkey back from progress. In 1926, he replaced it with a new legal system based on the Swiss Civil Code, banning polygamy and granting equal rights to men and women in marriage and divorce. For the first time, women had legal protection against forced marriages and abuse, a monumental shift in a patriarchal society. But legal reform was just the beginning. Education, the very foundation of a modern nation, was in dire need of change. Under Ottoman rule, schools were dominated by religious teachings, and literacy was shockingly low. Mustafa Kemal launched a nationwide educational overhaul, shutting down religious schools, madrasas, and replacing them with secular, state-run institutions. He introduced a new Latin-based Turkish alphabet in 1928, replacing the old Arabic script, which was complex and difficult to learn. This was a revolutionary step, one that instantly boosted literacy rates, making reading and writing far more accessible to the common people. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Conservative and religious groups, once powerful under Ottoman rule, saw Kemal's reforms as an attack on Islam itself. Riots broke out in some regions, and opposition leaders denounced him as a dictator trying to erase Turkish traditions. Undeterred, Kemal pressed forward. He modernized clothing laws, banning the fez, a traditional Ottoman headwear associated with the old regime. Instead, he encouraged Western-style hats and suits, symbolizing a break from the past. This wasn't just about fashion, it was a political statement, a clear signal that Turkey was turning away from its Ottoman and Islamic past. His economic reforms were just as aggressive. The Ottoman economy had been crippled by debt and foreign dependency, but Kemal wanted Turkey to stand on its own feet. He nationalized industries, built railways, factories, and modern infrastructure, and promoted a strong, self-sufficient economy. By the early 1930s, Turkey no longer resembled the Ottoman Empire. It was a nation reborn, but at a cost. The rapid changes had alienated conservatives, angered religious leaders, and left some longing for the past. Kemal knew that revolutions came with resistance, but he wasn't finished yet. His most ambitious reforms were still ahead. Part 10: A New Identity, Language, Dress, and Education Overhaul. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was not just reshaping Turkey's politics, he was reshaping its soul. The reforms were not only about governance and laws, but about creating a new national identity, one that would break free from centuries of Ottoman and Islamic influence. To achieve this, he targeted language, clothing, and education, the pillars of cultural identity. For centuries, the Ottoman Turkish language had been written in the Arabic script, a system that was difficult to learn and largely inaccessible to the common people. The result was a shockingly low literacy rate, with only a small elite capable of reading and writing. Kemal saw this as a major barrier to modernization. If Turkey was to become a strong, educated, and independent nation, it needed a simple, efficient, and modern writing system. In 1928, he introduced the Latin-based Turkish alphabet, completely replacing the Arabic script. It was a radical move, one of the most ambitious language reforms in history. To ensure mass adoption, he personally toured the country, chalkboard in hand, teaching citizens how to write in the new script. Within just a few years, literacy rates skyrocketed, and for the first time, ordinary Turkish citizens could easily read newspapers, books, and official documents. But language was just one part of the transformation. The way Turks dressed was also deeply tied to Ottoman and Islamic traditions. Kemal believed that a modern nation needed a modern image, and so he targeted traditional Ottoman clothing. In 1925, He banned the fez, a widely used Ottoman hat that had become a symbol of the old empire. Instead, he promoted Western-style hats, suits, and ties, encouraging men to adopt European fashion. The fez ban sparked outrage. Many saw it as an attack on Turkish heritage, and some religious groups refused to abandon traditional attire. There were even violent protests, with some claiming that Kemal was trying to erase Islam from public life. But he remained firm. To him, clothing was not just fabric, it was a representation of a nation's direction. A break from Ottoman fashion was a break from the past. For Turkish women, the reforms were even more revolutionary. Under Ottoman rule, women had limited access to education, no political rights, and were expected to remain veiled and confined to traditional roles. Kemal abolished restrictive dress codes, allowing women to wear Western-style clothing if they chose. But more importantly, he pushed for their active participation in society. This was directly tied to his transformation of education. The Ottoman school system had been deeply religious, focusing more on Islamic teachings than practical knowledge. Kemal shut down religious schools, madrasas, and replaced them with state-run secular institutions, focusing on science, mathematics, and modern subjects. For the first time, education was made compulsory for both boys and girls. Female literacy rates began to rise rapidly, and new universities opened their doors to women who had been previously excluded from higher education. Kemal knew that shaping a new identity meant facing resistance, and he was prepared for it. The conservative elite, religious scholars, and even some rural communities resented these sweeping changes, seeing them as a betrayal of Turkey's Islamic heritage. But he believed in his vision. Turkey had to evolve or risk falling behind in the modern world. With language, clothing, and education redefined, the Turkish people were no longer just Ottomans living under a new government. They were citizens of a brand new nation. But not everyone accepted these changes easily. Opposition to Ataturk's reforms was growing, and soon, the battle for Turkey's future would reach a boiling point. Part 11. Opposition and Resistance, Facing Internal and External Threats. Despite Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's relentless drive to modernize Turkey, not everyone embraced his vision. His sweeping reforms had dismantled centuries of Ottoman traditions, and with each radical change, opposition grew louder and more dangerous. From within Turkey, religious conservatives, former Ottoman elites, and disillusioned factions saw him as a dictator erasing the past. Meanwhile, foreign powers still had their eyes on Turkey, hoping to weaken its newfound independence. The abolition of the Caliphate in 1924 had already angered Islamic scholars and clerics. They viewed Ataturk's secular policies as a direct attack on Islam. The closure of religious schools, the banning of Islamic courts, and the enforcement of Western-style clothing and civil laws only fueled the fire. Many traditionalists resisted these changes, seeing them as an attempt to strip Turkey of its identity. Some imams and former Ottoman officials rallied against him, warning that Turkey was losing its soul. But opposition did not come from religious groups alone. Political rivals also emerged, challenging Kemal's grip on power. In 1924, he allowed a brief experiment with multi-party democracy, leading to the formation of the Progressive Republican Party, led by former allies who had turned against him. The party quickly became a hub for conservatives, nationalists, and Islamic groups, all united in their opposition to Ataturk's radical secularism. The conflict escalated when, in 1925, the Sheikh Zayed rebellion erupted. A Kurdish Islamist uprising, it was one of the biggest threats to Ataturk's rule, fueled by anger over the abolition of Islamic laws. Thousands of rebels took up arms, declaring their desire to restore the Caliphate and end Kemal's secular rule. The Turkish government responded with brutal force, crushing the rebellion within months. But the message was clear: Turkey's transformation would not happen without bloodshed. Fearing more uprisings, Ataturk cracked down on opposition ruthlessly. In 1926, An assassination plot against him was uncovered in Izmir, orchestrated by former political opponents and Ottoman loyalists. The plan was to eliminate him and restore the old order, but the conspirators were caught and swiftly executed or imprisoned. This was a turning point. Ataturk realized that his enemies would stop at nothing to undo his work. The crackdown intensified. The Progressive Republican Party was banned, and political opposition became nearly impossible. Ataturk ruled with an iron fist, ensuring that no force, whether religious, political, or foreign, could threaten the Republic's survival. Externally, Western nations and old enemies were still watching Turkey closely. Britain and France, both colonial powers in the Middle East, were uneasy about Ataturk's nationalist stance. They had lost their chance to carve up Anatolia after World War I, and now they feared a strong, independent Turkey would inspire other nations to resist European control. Greece, still bitter over its defeat in the War of Independence, remained hostile, and tensions ran high over the treatment of Greek and Turkish minorities under the 1923 Population Exchange Agreement. The Soviet Union, despite being an early ally, also grew wary of Turkey's growing nationalism, fearing that it could stir unrest among Soviet Muslims. Ataturk faced enemies on all fronts, from within and beyond Turkey's borders. But he was not a man who backed down. He knew that the Republic could only survive if all opposition was neutralized, and he was willing to do whatever it took to secure Turkey's future. With opposition crushed and his authority cemented, he turned his attention back to the people. It was time for his most revolutionary act yet, the empowerment of women. Part 12, The Woman's Revolution, Empowering Half the Nation. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk believed that a modern Turkey could not be built while half of its population remained in the shadows. For centuries, Ottoman society had confined women to traditional roles, denying them education, political rights, and public participation. But in Ataturk's vision, women were not just supporters of progress, they were essential to it. His reforms would give them a voice, an identity, and an active role in shaping the nation's future. The change began with education. Under Ottoman rule, most girls were denied schooling, and the few who received an education were usually restricted to religious teachings. Ataturk saw this as a national disaster, believing that an uneducated mother raises an uneducated child. He made education compulsory for both boys and girls, ensuring that literacy among women surged in just a few years. Universities, once almost exclusively male, began accepting female students, and women were encouraged to pursue careers in science, law, and medicine. But education alone was not enough. Ataturk wanted women to have full legal rights, starting with their freedom from outdated Islamic laws. The 1926 Civil Code replaced Sharia-based marriage and family laws with a secular legal system, granting women the right to divorce, outlawing polygamy, and ensuring equal inheritance rights. These changes shocked conservative circles, but for the first time in Turkish history, women were no longer second-class citizens. Then came the most radical step, political rights. In a world where even many Western democracies had not yet granted women full suffrage, Ataturk pushed Turkey ahead. In 1930, Turkish women won the right to vote in municipal elections, a groundbreaking moment in a nation that had been ruled by sultans just a decade earlier. By 1934, Turkish women were granted full voting rights in national elections, years before France, Italy, or Switzerland. Ataturk didn't stop at just giving them the right to vote. He encouraged them to run for office. By 1935, 18 women were elected to the Turkish parliament, a staggering achievement for a country that had just stepped out of centuries of patriarchal rule. This was not just a symbolic gesture. Ataturk actively promoted women in leadership roles, showing that they were not just participants in democracy, but shapers of it. Yet, not everyone welcomed this transformation. Conservative factions, religious groups, and even some rural communities resisted these changes fiercely. Many refused to accept women in leadership roles, arguing that Ataturk's reforms went against tradition and faith. Some protested the removal of Islamic dress codes, while others viewed female participation in politics as unnatural. But Ataturk did not yield. He personally encouraged women to step forward, telling them, "Our nation cannot move forward if we leave our women behind." He saw the battle for women's rights as a battle for Turkey's survival, and he fought it with the same determination as he had fought on the battlefield. By the late 1930s, the role of women in Turkey had been completely transformed. They were teachers, doctors, lawyers, politicians, and scientists, a sight unimaginable just a decade earlier. The Turkish woman had gone from being voiceless to being a pillar of the new republic. But with every victory, new challenges arose. Even as Turkey marched forward, it faced an internal struggle between modernization and tradition. The question remained, could Ataturk's vision survive in a society still deeply connected to its past? Part 13: Modernization versus Tradition: The Struggles of a New Era. As Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's sweeping reforms reshaped Turkey, a deep divide emerged. While his supporters celebrated the transformation of a once feudal empire into a modern republic, others viewed these rapid changes as an assault on their traditions, faith, and identity. The battle between modernization and tradition was far from over, and Ataturk knew that securing the future of Turkey would require more than just laws. It would require a shift in the national mindset. One of the most controversial reforms was the overhaul of the Turkish language. For centuries, Ottoman Turkish had been written in a complex Arabic script, making literacy difficult for the masses. Ataturk believed that language was the key to modernization, and in 1928, he abolished the Arabic script and introduced the Latin alphabet. This reform made learning easier, but it also alienated the older generation, who suddenly could not read their own history or religious texts. To Ataturk, this was a necessary sacrifice, a break from the Ottoman past in order to embrace the future. Yet, not everyone was willing to break with the past. Many Turks, especially in rural areas, still clung to traditional ways of life, religious customs, and Ottoman-era values. Ataturk's secularization of Turkey, removing Islam from governance, banning religious attire in public institutions, and closing Islamic schools, caused resentment. While the cities embraced modernization, the countryside remained deeply conservative, creating a cultural and ideological divide that would persist for generations. Even among the educated elite, there were fears that modernization was moving too fast. Some argued that a gradual transition would have been wiser, giving people time to adjust instead of forcing change through decrees. But Ataturk was not a man of half measures. He believed that Turkey could not afford to wait, and he was willing to impose reforms by force if necessary. The divide between tradition and modernization was also evident in Turkey's international relations. Ataturk's policies had severed ties with the Islamic world, as Turkey no longer positioned itself as a leader of Muslim nations. Instead, he pursued closer relations with the West, modeling Turkey's legal system, education, and governance on European nations. Some viewed this as a betrayal of Turkey's Islamic heritage, while others saw it as the only path to survival in a world dominated by modern powers. Despite opposition, Ataturk remained unwavering. He pushed forward with industrialization, building factories, railways, and modern infrastructure to ensure Turkey could compete on a global stage. He introduced new economic policies, agricultural reforms, and technological advancements, believing that a strong economy was just as vital as cultural modernization. By the late 1930s, Turkey was no longer the decaying empire it had once been. It had a new identity, a new language, a secular government, and an expanding economy. But while Ataturk had succeeded in laying the foundations of a modern state, the battle between tradition and progress would continue long after his time. As his health began to decline, Ataturk reflected on the future of Turkey. He had spent his life fighting for this new republic, but would it survive without him? Part 14: The Final Years: Illness, Reflection, and Legacy. By the late 1930s, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk had transformed Turkey from a crumbling empire into a modern republic. His reforms had reshaped education, politics, law, and culture, yet the struggle between modernization and tradition remained ongoing. Despite his successes, Atatürk was growing weary, not just from political battles, but from a fight he could not win: his own failing health. For years, Atatürk had lived at an unforgiving pace, constantly pushing himself and those around him to reshape the country as quickly as possible. His heavy drinking and relentless work schedule took a toll on his body, but he refused to slow down. By 1937, signs of serious illness began to appear. He suffered from fatigue, digestive issues, and abdominal pain, yet he dismissed concerns and continued working as if nothing had changed. However, by 1938, his condition had worsened. Doctors diagnosed him with cirrhosis of the liver, a disease likely caused by his excessive alcohol consumption. He was only 57 years old, but his body had endured decades of exhaustion, war, and stress. Despite the pain, Atatürk remained determined to serve until his last breath. He continued hosting meetings, overseeing policies, and traveling across Turkey, but those closest to him could see that the once unbreakable leader was fading. Even as his strength declined, his mind remained sharp, and his concerns for Turkey's future only grew. He worried about whether his reforms would hold strong after his passing. The tensions between secularists and conservatives, between modernists and traditionalists, had never fully disappeared. Would the Turkey he built stay on its path, or would the old ways creep back in? In his final months, Atatürk withdrew to Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul, where he spent his remaining days in a weakened state. His once powerful voice grew softer, and his once unstoppable energy began to fade. On November 10, 1938, at 9:05 a.m., Mustafa Kemal Atatürk took his final breath. The man who had defied empires, reshaped a nation, and forged a new identity for Turkey was gone. The news of his death sent shockwaves across Turkey. For millions, it was as if the sun had set on the republic. Streets filled with mourners, and an entire nation wept for the leader who had given them a new future. But even in death, Atatürk's presence was everywhere. His vision, his reforms, and his ideals were etched into the very foundation of Turkey. The question now remained: would the nation he built honor his legacy, or would it drift away from his path? Part 15, Eternal Impact. The Man Who Became Immortal. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was gone, but his presence could not be erased from Turkey's soul. His death in 1938 marked the end of an era, yet his legacy was only just beginning to take shape. For millions, he was not just a leader, he was the father of the Turkish Republic, the man who had lifted a nation from the ashes of empire and given it a new identity. As his funeral procession moved through the streets, grief swept across the country. Mourners lined the roads, weeping, saluting, and throwing flowers as his casket passed. The man who had once commanded armies now lay still, but his ideas, his vision, and his fight for modernization, secularism, and national pride continued to echo across Turkey. His body was first placed in the Ethnography Museum in Ankara, but in 1953, it was moved to Anıtkabir, a grand mausoleum built to honor him for eternity. Atatürk's reforms remained at the core of Turkey's identity. The alphabet change, secular legal system, women's rights, and modern education reforms continued shaping the nation for decades. His vision of a strong, independent, and forward-thinking Turkey was embraced by many, but it also faced challenges. After his death, Turkey experienced political instability, coups, and ideological struggles. Some sought to uphold his legacy, while others questioned or resisted the reforms he had imposed. Even beyond Turkey, Atatürk's impact was felt worldwide. Leaders from developing nations admired his ability to modernize a country while maintaining national sovereignty. He became a symbol of resistance against colonialism, inspiring movements across the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. His military strategies were studied by officers worldwide, and his bold governance style influenced generations of leaders. Despite political shifts and changing governments, Ataturk's presence never faded from Turkish society. His statues stand in public squares, his speeches are still quoted by politicians, and every year on November 10th, at exactly 9:05 a.m., the entire nation pauses in silence to honor him. Ataturk had once said, "My mortal body will turn to dust, but the Republic of Turkey will last forever." His body may have perished, but his ideals, his vision, and his relentless fight for progress live on. Today, his name remains synonymous with resilience, reform, and revolution. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was more than a leader. He was a force of history, a man who shaped the destiny of a nation, and a figure whose impact will never be forgotten. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.